Welcome to Talking Beats with Daniel Lelchuk. We hope you'll subscribe and give us a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Now, if you like the show, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/talkingbeats. That's patreon.com/talkingbeats. We believe now more than ever in providing a platform for individuality, free thought, and a diverse range of views. By supporting the show this way, you'll get early access to episodes, bonus episodes, and much, much more. Remember, the conversation is always active at Talking Beats Podcast on social media. Here's Daniel Lelchuk.
On today's program, we're speaking with author and historian Marty Sherwin. He's university professor at George Mason and the author of numerous books, including A World Destroyed, Hiroshima and Its Legacies, and American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, written with Kai Bird, that won the Pulitzer-prize for biography. Marty Sherwin, the preeminent historian of the Cold War, is out with a new book that is redefining our relationship to this volatile, fragile period of time. The book, Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette, From Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, is riveting and frankly scary, and I'm thrilled to have the author, longtime friend of mine, by the way, right here with me, Marty Sherwin. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Glad to be here.
You've been writing about the Cold War, writing about nuclear weapons for decades. What was it about the Cuban Missile Crisis that was either unanswered or unexplained or not sufficiently contextualized by other books and other tellings that made you feel you have to do something in this area?
Well, I turned to the Cuban Missile Crisis for a variety of reasons. I had begun my career with a book about building and using the atomic bomb called The World Destroyed, Hiroshima and Its Legacies. And then I wrote a book about Robert Oppenheimer with Kai Bird, American Prometheus. So my next question was, sort of where do I go from here? What is the next big issue that was emerging during the nuclear age between Hiroshima and Oppenheimer? And the Cuban Missile Crisis was the obvious choice. What I would find, what would be new, is something I didn't know for sure. That's the excitement of doing history. You have an idea, you formulate it as best you can. You write a proposal. If you're lucky, you get a contract. And then you dive into the archives and all the readings and you think about it as hard as you can. And you generally find something new. And I certainly did.
I imagine in historical research, you find things you don't expect to find, and you don't find things you do expect to find. What happened most in the process of this? Was it information you sort of assumed that you didn't end up finding, or was it real surprises that you had no clue about?
Well, it was both, actually. Very shrewd of you to frame it that way, Daniel. I began this project as an investigation of the military's role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously, it had been covered, but no one had really covered that in the depth that I thought it would be useful to cover it. So the proposal was the military and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Surprise! I found out that in 1975, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had destroyed all of the minutes of the Joint Chiefs meetings between 1948, when the Chiefs were formed in their current role, and 1975. I think it was because of the church committee hearings that were looking into government improprieties. And they used an excuse of sorting through their documents for creating a more efficient system or something like that. So the idea of focusing on the military exclusively did not pan out. So that was number one. What I hoped to find, I didn't find. But it was a good thing. Because that led me to rethink the project and integrate what information we did have on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which was minutes, which were notes taken from those minutes before they were destroyed, and integrating it into the full story from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think one of the findings that I emphasize is that you can't think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as something that sort of suddenly dropped out of the sky because Khrushchev got this crazy idea to sneak missiles into Cuba. It was an evolutionary thing. The reason he tried to sneak Soviet missiles into Cuba was because of the entire history of how nuclear weapons were used from Hiroshima until 1962. And primarily how they were used by the United States, primarily under the Eisenhower administration, which provided Khrushchev with a blueprint for how he used nuclear weapons.
You've talked about the 13-day period, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you've also talked about the 17-year period that you just alluded to, the long, as you call it, the long Cuban Missile Crisis. Why do you think it helps to look at the long version, the 17-year version? And then I want to get into, as well, some of the shocking things that I learned in this book about Eisenhower and his incredible contradictory public-private statements and sentiments. But what does the 17-year, the long Cuban Missile Crisis teach us as we look towards the brief period of 13 days?
I'm a historian, and I think one of the responsibilities of a historian is to look at the roots of things. Everything is connected, and events do not occur like a big bang that sort of suddenly and unexpectedly happens. Everything has roots. And in all of the books that I've written, A World Destroyed, for example, when you talk about why Hiroshima was bombed, most of the work up until I wrote that book focused on when Truman came into office after Roosevelt died. Well, I went back to Roosevelt and to 1939 and looked at what the connection was between what Roosevelt had done and Truman would end up doing. And the same thing was true with Oppenheimer. Most of the biographies and studies of Oppenheimer focused on the Manhattan Project and his hearing. Well, Kai and I went back to the roots, to his childhood, to trying to understand what made Oppenheimer, who was the critical force in getting nuclear weapons built in time to be used during the war. The same thing is true of the Cuban Missile Crisis. You cannot understand why Khrushchev decided to put medium range and intermediate range missiles into Cuba, as opposed to putting a huge military force, just tactical nuclear weapons, or some other kind of munitions to protect Castro. Why did he choose these maximum rockets to put in Cuba? Well, the answer is Eisenhower had shipped similar rockets, similar missiles to Europe, to Turkey and Italy after October 1957, when the Soviets launched Sputnik. So Eisenhower's response was those missiles to Europe to protect our allies. Well, Khrushchev's response was those same kind of missiles to Cuba to protect his new best friend, Fidel Castro.
This may be a ignorant question, but why did Khrushchev care so much about Castro? What was Castro to him? I mean, wasn't it sort of a inconsequential place so far away in the world? And I guess it's close to the U.S. geographically, but what was his association? What was his obsession with protecting Cuba?
Cuba was a gift to Castro. That Eisenhower's very rigid, anti-communist, foolish policies gave Castro. It was an opportunity for the Soviets to penetrate the Western Hemisphere. It was a piece of golden territory for the Soviet Union. Remember, the 1950s and 60s is a time of intense competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for the allegiance of the third world. And Cuba's being a communist government was just a fantastic opportunity for Khrushchev. In fact, it was so important to Khrushchev that it became the focus of his attention. He had two major considerations. One was protecting this communist government in the Western Hemisphere as an example of the Soviet Union's ability to advance communism into the third world. And his second concern was getting the United States, the British, and the French out of West Berlin, which was 100 and something miles into East German territory. And these two concerns became connected during the Cuban Missile Crisis in a very interesting way.
Can you zoom out a little and just talk about, for a listener who has no clue about the Cuban Missile Crisis other than a little background maybe, or maybe not even that. We have the background that Khrushchev is installing these nuclear weapons in Cuba. Give a little more. Why should the average listener in the 21st century be so concerned about the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis was the most dangerous moment in world history, not just in the Cold War, in world history. It was a crisis that brought nuclear weapons to the brink of being used. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis are absolutely critical for understanding, one, how the United States and the Soviet Union moved forward from 1962 to the end of the Cold War. And the lessons are powerful with respect to how presidents and premiers and anybody who has control of nuclear weapons should think about them in a crisis, or should not think about them in a particular way during a crisis. It's the most important moment in world history.
Give a little background about about yourself, about your military service. In 1962, you were a junior officer in the U.S. Navy, and you had a rather specific role to play. You were the squadron's air intelligence officer, and you write, "My responsibilities made me the custodian of our top secret documents, our deployment orders in the event of war. Those orders were periodically updated, and when they were, a senior staff officer, always accompanied by an armed Marine, arrived with a sealed envelope." So talk about, if you would, address how your own personal history, 50 years earlier than the publication of this book, influenced or began to awaken your own curiosity about what the hell these envelopes contained that you were putting in a vault.
Yes, no, that was a very interesting moment for me, to say the least. So it's 1962. October, and I am the Air Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant JG, for Patrol Squadron 31, which was stationed in San Diego. I received word about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, maybe 3 days before Kennedy announced that he was blockading Cuba. That announcement took place on October 22nd, a Monday night. I received word earlier that week that an operation I was going to participate in, I was going to navigate an admiral's plane around the world for this fabulous global trip, was canceled. Nobody knew exactly why, except that we got rumors that Marines at El Toro Air Station, about an hour from us, were boarding planes and heading east, and everybody thought it was a Berlin crisis. Well, probably on October 22nd, the morning that before Kennedy gave his speech, I was ordered to retrieve that envelope from the inner sanctum of my safe with the top secret orders, take it over to the skipper's office, where I met with the skipper, the executive officer, and the operations officer, and we opened the orders. And they were deployment orders, essentially, if war broke out. And my squadron was going to deploy to Baja California. And the reason for that was dispersing all aircraft to areas where Soviet missiles would not reach them. So it was pretty dramatic. But the embarrassing thing for me was the recognition afterwards that I was not scared, I was not upset. Some of my junior officer friends, none of us were married, and therefore I think a lot less mature about these things. Said, "Oh, Baja California, what a great place to die." Big joke. And as I say in the book, it was not until I really researched this Cuban Missile Crisis in depth that I realized how close to death we had come.
Now, at that point, did you want to be a historian, or you were just going to keep going through the ranks in the military, or were you thinking, God, I got to go write some things down and do some research?
No. I wasn't that serious as a historian at that point, but I was due to finish my military obligation in about 3 or 4 months from that point, and I was applying to graduate schools. As I said, I was in San Diego, and I got into UCLA. And I made an arrangement with the skipper of our squadron that I would take the duty on the weekends, which everybody was delighted about, if he would let me drive up from San Diego to Los Angeles and take classes during the first weeks of the semester before I got out of the military, which was an arrangement that worked out.
One thing that I found it a little hard to grapple with in this book was Eisenhower's relationship to nuclear weapons. He says one thing in public, he says one thing in private. He says a number of times in public, quoting here, "I was against the atomic bombings in Japan on 2 counts. First, the Japanese were ready to surrender, and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Second,
True.
I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon." But at the same time, his Secretary of State Dulles is giving these speeches saying that nuclear weapons are the first line of defense. And, it is a little confusing about Eisenhower. Can you explain all this?
Yes, but it's important to underline that we are not talking about at the same time. In 1945, Eisenhower was a general who had won his war in Europe, and he had a very shrewd perspective on the consequences of using nuclear weapons. He was absolutely correct. They were not necessary to end the war. The Japanese were ready to surrender as soon as the Soviets came into the war, as they were committed to do and for their own reasons wanted to do. The Japanese had to surrender because they understood that when the Soviets came into the war, they could not fight a two-front war. Soviets would be coming in from the north. They were preparing to meet the Americans in the south. And also the Japanese were more anti-communist than the Americans. And the idea of a Soviet occupation was the worst possible nightmare. So surrendering to the Americans suddenly became the best option. Eisenhower understood that.
Isn't there a narrative that, I know you would say it's a mistaken narrative, but isn't there a popular narrative or a widely held narrative that America had to use the bombs to end the war?
Yes, of course. That's the argument that Truman made. And what other argument would we make having used the atomic bombs? Of course, it was argued that they were necessary, but they weren't. The invasion was scheduled for November. We're talking about August. The Soviets were coming into the war no later than the 12th or 13th of August. They came in on August 9th. The one effect that the atomic bomb had was that it moved the Soviet invasion up about 2 or 3 days. There's always the question that people should ask, and all historians should ask when they frame their work. How do we know what we know? And when it comes to government decisions, we know what we know by what we're told, what the government tells journalists, what the government announces over the radio, and so on and so forth. The fantastic thing about historical research, the exciting thing about it, is that 50 years after an event, when we're talking about government affairs, we generally know much more about what really happened than we knew at the time, because we get to see the documents. We get to see all the secret information that was discussed, but not revealed at the time. The soldiers who believed that the atomic bomb saved their lives because there was otherwise would have been an invasion, they understood that because they were told that. But that is not simply how it happened. But, we could go on for hours talking about Hiroshima. We have to move on from there to the question you asked about Eisenhower. He correctly analyzed the situation and concluded that it was not necessary to use the atomic bomb to end the war in August of 1945. But that was when he had perspective. He becomes president in January of 1953. The Korean War has not been an armistice has not been reached. He is a fiscal conservative. He's also a ideological anti-communist. We have a notation from his diary in 1946 in which he writes, "We are in a war to the death with communism." And this is 1946. It's not even a year after the Grand Alliance defeated, the Germans, and he's pointing towards this battle to the death. He never talks about this publicly, but deep down inside, he is an ideologue. So in 1953, he looks around and says, "How do I deal with this Soviet threat most efficiently?" And he said, "Well, nuclear weapons. The United States has a great nuclear weapons advantage." By 53, the Soviets had developed their own atomic bomb, which they first tested in August of 1949, but they were way behind us. And he develops this massive retaliation idea and brinksmanship, and sends John Foster Dulles off to essentially threaten the Soviet Union with nuclear war, which really provides the framework for the nuclear arms race as we came to live it and to understand it.
And speaking of 1953, as you write, there was a possibility, there was an opening maybe for easing of the tensions. March 1953, Stalin drops dead, and
Right.
and you highlight such a missed opportunity to dial things back or to lower the temperature, and just talk about how the U.S. did nothing on that front.
When Eisenhower came into office, with this very clear idea that nuclear weapons would be moved from a more or less a backstop position that Truman kept them in to the forefront by promoting this massive retaliation doctrine. The entire sort of framework for how Eisenhower was going to deal with foreign policy on the military end was already set. And when Stalin died, there was obviously discussions about, what does this mean? And the bottom line seemed to be, Stalinism is communism, and communism is Stalinism. The fact that Stalin is dead really doesn't change communism. And so onward the way we are going right now. And all of the committees that Eisenhower had developed to analyze how to best use nuclear weapons just move forward with their work as it was designed, even before Stalin's death. There was no effort to, maybe we should develop another committee to examine what are the implications. I mean, who's going to take over? What are these guys going to be like? Will communism be different? The idea that communism would be different was just totally rejected. But it was different. Khrushchev was very, very, very different than Stalin.
And he gave this long 4-hour speech, and the American government got the text of that speech at one point, didn't they?
Between 1953 and 1956, there's a lot of jostling in the Soviet government for who was going to be the top dog. First, it's Malenkov, then Khrushchev manages to take over by 1955 or so. And he decides that at the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Union in February 1956, he is going to essentially transform both domestic Soviet policy and Soviet military policy. And at the end of the 20th Party Congress, he adds an extra secret session and delivers this 4-hour speech that does two things. One, denounces Stalin's cult of personality and his reign of terror, really sort of rips into the history of the Soviet Union in a way that exposes the horrors of Stalinism, which is, to say the very least, shocking to all of the Soviet delegates.
It seems very brave of him, no?
Oh, it's huge. It was the most courageous thing, I think any Soviet politician ever did. And in fact, maybe it's the most courageous thing that any politician, ever did. And for our purposes, has a second speech in which he argues that we no longer can think about war because nuclear war will absolutely destroy every nation that participates in it. And so he makes a proposal for a new strategy called peaceful coexistence, which is an incredible change. And exactly, the opposite of what Eisenhower is arguing, which is massive retaliation. So, we have this, sort of imbalance with the United States military, mainly Strategic Air Command, arguing that peaceful coexistence is just a curtain that to hide the Soviet intention of taking over the world.
Doesn't it make you wonder, or does it make you wonder, as a historian, as someone who knows as much more than anybody about this, why there was that imbalance, why there was no one in the American government saying at the time, listen to what he's saying, and maybe we can adjust a little bit as well, why there was such an obstinate hard-headedness and sort of continuing with those blinders on.
Anti-communism became the foundation of the American political system. There was a bipartisan agreement between Democrats and Republicans that the Soviets were an existential threat, and they were determined to destroy the United States, and everything was built around that psychologically. But there were dissenters. Adli Stevenson plays a very important role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and remember, he is the Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1952 and 1956 against Eisenhower. And during his campaigns, he argues for a much more reasonable, measured, I guess you would have to say, peaceful or cooperative approach towards the Soviet Union. But he totally rejected. Why? Because the American public has, for the most part, been committed to this idea that we are in a battle to the death with the Soviet Union.
I want to get into the Adli Stevenson and the Kennedys' history and relationship, but I'm just looking down here, and of course there's a nice little paragraph about Van Cliburn winning the Tchaikovsky competition over in Moscow in 1958, the first American to do so, and I love how Khrushchev asks the great composer Shostakovich, who was the head of the jury, is he the best? And he says yes, and Khrushchev says, give him the prize. And Marty Sherwin, you know this show is called Talking Beats, and everybody has to just talk a little bit about music, musician or not. And I know you're a music lover, but any music happening in your life right now on YouTube or wherever?
Well, I listen to you, Daniel. I have your records, your beautiful cello records. So I call them records. Of course, they're not records; they're CDs. But I'm just exposing my age.
Well, records are making a big comeback anyway. So millennials are all about records.
Okay, I just learned something.
Well, so have you always been a music lover? Are you a musicer? You like music somehow? It's always played a role in your life?
I do love music. I am a totally incompetent musician. I cannot even carry a tune. But for some reason, classical music is something that soothes me.
As is it for me too, and obviously I love the first Tchaikovsky piano concerto that Van Cliburn played over there in 1958 and won the competition. That was a great moment culturally.
I just want to pick up on this music a little bit. The question is, what is a section of a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis have to do with Van Cliburn winning this contest in Moscow? Well, I thought that it demonstrated Khrushchev's openness to reaching out to the West. Everybody expected the Soviet, a Soviet performer to win that first great Moscow, conference. And here this lanky Texan comes along and just knocks everybody out of their chairs in the hall with his, performance. He gets huge standing ovations, and suddenly there is a crisis for the judges. He's clearly the best, but how can we possibly give an American, this prize? So they call Khrushchev, and Khrushchev just says, "Is he the best? If he's the best, give him the prize." And then Khrushchev comes over and when the prize is awarded and he's there and he gives Van Cliburn one of his famous bear hugs. And there's a picture in the book, it's Mutt and Jeff. Van Cliburn's this 6 foot plus, I think 6'3" or 4", lanky Texan, and Khrushchev, kind of comes up to the middle of his chest. And to me, it represents an attitude that was totally lacking at that time in the United States. The government hostility was palpable towards the Soviet Union.
Let's talk Adli Stevenson, because he does emerge as it. Well, I'll ask it this way: is he the one hero of all? Is he one of the heroes of this whole thing?
Well, there are many kinds of heroes during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev are the responsible agents for the crisis at the beginning, but at the end, they are partners trying to solve this crisis without a war. But Adli Stevenson, and this is one of the original points that I make in Gambling with Armageddon. Adli Stevenson emerges at the very beginning of the crisis as the most sensible and far-sighted and important analyst of how to resolve this crisis quickly. Another theme of Gambling with Armageddon is luck and the role that luck plays. And with respect to Adlai Stevenson, there's luck involved. Kennedy is informed on the morning of October 16th that Soviet missiles have been discovered in Cuba. He has a meeting with a collection of advisors who eventually get labeled the EXCOM, Executive Committee of the National Security Council. He has a meeting with them at 11:30, and then he has a luncheon appointment to fet I think it's Libya. But in any case, he has this formal diplomatic luncheon. And it just so happened, by luck, that Adlai Stevenson, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, came down from New York that morning and had a previous arrangement to join Kennedy for that luncheon. After lunch, Kennedy takes Stevenson up to the family quarters and shows him the U-2 photographs of the Soviet missiles in Cuba. And he says to Stevenson, I guess we're going to have to bomb or invade Cuba to get them out. And Stevenson immediately says, oh, no. That is not a good idea. We can do this diplomatically. And in the course of the conversation, he lays out, right off the top of his head, the blueprint for how the Cuban Missile Crisis is in fact resolved. We know all this and we know the details because Stevenson sums them up in a memorandum he then sends to Kennedy the next day about their conversation. And so Kennedy, who began with agreeing with his advisors that bombing or invasion was going to be the way to remove the Soviet missiles, is confronted with this memorandum, with this conversation first on the 16th, and then this memorandum on the 17th, laying out a very different approach. And I make the case that Stevenson's conversation and memorandum with Kennedy are absorbed by John Kennedy as he begins to think through this problem that he's facing. And he becomes, in effect, an advocate for the Stevenson approach. And in the end of the crisis, he is an isolated advocate. All his advisors are against the effort to solve the problem diplomatically in a particular way that the crisis concludes, and we can talk about that.
And just before we get to the way it concludes, what is Bobby Kennedy doing at this time, and what does he write in 13 Days, his memoir of the crisis?
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. The section on the Cuban Missile Crisis in the book is based on the secret tape recordings of all of these EXCOM meetings. Kennedy had a secret tape recording system installed about 3 or 4 months before the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. And so we have the exact words of those people who were advising Kennedy and the president himself when he was in those meetings. Bobby Kennedy, who portrays himself in his memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 Days, as the great peacemaker. Well, he is a peacemaker when his brother tells him that that's what he wants him to do. But throughout the crisis, Bobby just goes, I would say, off in crazy directions. I mean, at one point he says, maybe we got to get this over with quickly, sink the Maine or something in order to have an excuse to invade Cuba. Other times he says, if this is what the Soviets want, maybe we should just get it over with now as quickly as possible. He's a very loose cannon. He's a young kid with huge responsibilities, and he's not ready for them. And the Bobby Kennedy we know, we think we know, 1968, is very different from the Bobby Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
So talk about the way that they got out of it. They were following Adli Stevenson's blueprint, as you said. So how did it get resolved?
There are really two parts to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The first part is from October 16th, the day that Kennedy was informed that the missiles were in Cuba, until the evening of October 22nd, when he gave his television address announcing to the world that we were going to blockade Cuba in order to force the Soviets to take their missiles out of Cuba. That is the American crisis exclusively. We have not informed the Soviets that we know about their missiles, and the ex-com and Kennedy debate how we're going to get rid of those missiles. For the first few days, the consensus is very much supported by the Joint Chiefs that we're going to have to bomb or invade Cuba or both. But Kennedy, having received Stevenson's memorandum and listening to his advisors' hawkish suggestions, begins to reconsider the idea of bombing or invasion. And he begins to focus on the idea of blockading the Soviets. Blockading, Cuba completely, but mainly, of course, from the Soviets. The advisors are arguing, for the most part, there are some splits, that, well, this might be even more dangerous because a blockade is an act of war. And then somebody comes up with the idea that, well, let's not call it a blockade, let's call it a quarantine. And so on and so forth. So Kennedy essentially forces the blockade as a preferred option and announces that on October 22nd in the evening. Now the Cuban Missile Crisis is in full bloom. Khrushchev is in a total panic when he learns that Kennedy is going to give a speech. He thinks that Kennedy's speech is going to announce that the United States is invading Cuba. When he finds out that that is not the case, that it's going to be a blockade, he rotates into a different frame of mind and decides to confront Kennedy with charges of piracy and illegal action, and he has every right to defend his ally Castro. So what we have is a standoff between Tuesday, October 23rd, and Sunday, October 28th, when the crisis is resolved. Now, what happens during those tension-riven days that could have and seem to be heading towards a nuclear war? The president is determined to get those missiles out of there. Why? Not because they're a threat to the United States. McNamara says they don't really change the balance of power. Kennedy himself says, what's the difference if you're killed by a missile coming from Cuba or a missile coming from Moscow or from a Soviet submarine off the shores of the United States? It's a political problem. They all agree it's a political problem, but the missiles have to go. So with that, the question is how to force the missiles out. Well, by near the end of the week, a lot of messages being exchanged between the United States and between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And towards the end of the week, Kennedy agrees that he will commit to not invading Cuba if Khrushchev takes his missiles out of Cuba. That is in response to a letter that Kennedy receives near the end of the week from Khrushchev. Then another letter comes up on Saturday, which Khrushchev announces over Radio Moscow. And therefore, it's not a secret letter. It's a message to the whole world in which Khrushchev says, well, yes, I'll accept the pledge that you will not invade Cuba, but also I want you to remove those very dangerous intermediate range missiles that you and Eisenhower inserted in Turkey 130 miles from the Soviet Union. Kennedy says to his ex-com advisors, we are not going to have a very good war if everybody understands that all we had to do is take these junk missiles out of Turkey in exchange for the Soviets taking their missiles out of Cuba. But his advisors are absolutely to a man against this, to a man except for Stevenson. And Kennedy becomes totally isolated and committed to the idea that he is not going to slide into a nuclear war because his advisors don't want him to trade these missiles in Cuba, in Turkey, for the missiles in Cuba. And in the end, he sends his brother Bobby Kennedy to, and this is on Saturday night, October 27th, the day before Khrushchev agrees to take his missiles out of Cuba. Kennedy sends his brother to meet with Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin and in effect tell him that the missiles will be out of Turkey within a few months. You have to keep this secret. We will deny it and we will not do it if you expose, this agreement. But the president guarantees that the missiles will be out of Turkey. And that's the way the crisis was resolved. Kennedy agreed to not invade Cuba and publicly, and secretly agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey.
Here we are in 2021. How much progress have we made as a world since the early 60s, since the mid 40s? Where are we?
Well, we're in a very dangerous place, and of course we have been since Hiroshima. We have survived or avoided a nuclear war, partly by recognizing that a nuclear war is suicidal, but also because of luck. As you know, Gambling with Armageddon begins with this incredible story of Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes on the blockade line, being attacked by American anti-submarine warfare forces, attacked not to destroy them, but to try to surface them. But one of the submarine captains believes that explosive charges being thrown overboard are meant to destroy him, and he orders his nuclear torpedo loaded and shouts, "We will not be the disgrace of the Soviet Navy. We are going to take them. We are all going to be killed, but we're going to take them with us." And he gets ready to fire this nuclear torpedo at the American ASW aircraft carrier that's in the area. That's 3,000 to 4,000 men aboard that carrier. At the very last minute, another officer by the name of Vasily Arkhipov, who was the same rank as the captain, manages to talk him out of this idea of firing the nuclear warhead torpedo. And the luck involved of having Arkhipov arbitrarily assigned to that submarine. He was just being transported to Cuba. He was not part of the crew. Essentially saved the world from a nuclear war. These dangerous kinds of things happen all the time. There's an incident in September 1983 where another Soviet officer decides that a report that missiles have been fired by the United States at the Soviet Union is a false alarm. And he analyzes this very shrewdly. And if somebody else was on duty at that time, it would have been reported to higher command, and the Soviets may have responded. We are, dangling, as Kennedy said at the United Nations in 1961, I think it was, a sword of Damocles hanging by a thread over humanity. And we're still in that same position, and will remain in that position unless we figure out how to get rid of nuclear weapons.
On that note, Marty Sherwin, with the new book, Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette, From Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Marty Sherwin, I thank you sincerely.
Well, I thank you, Daniel, for taking the time and letting me talk about this very important topic.
You've been listening to Talking Beats with Daniel Elchuk. The original theme music is by Ronald Barkham. The content coordinator is Nathaniel Mosé, and Doug Christian is executive producer. We invite you to subscribe and leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can support us at patreon.com/talkingbeats. That's patreon.com/talkingbeats. And be sure to check us out on social media. We'll see you next time on Talking Beats with Daniel Elchuk.